In this video, we're going to take a look at Noodler's Tokyo Gift Cherry Blossom. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. I see some tone variation by pen, and lighter tones do give some shading, but I don't want the lighter tones or the shading here. In its darker tone, it is indeed a beautiful cherry red. Not just some red ink on the page, but really shows as much more than that. Seeing a red like this, bold but not screaming, not obnoxious, just bold and in control of that page. It's how red inks should be. I really feel like if more reds had the kind of qualities coming through in this one, then red would be a much more popular color in inks. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Pilot Vanishing Point with a medium nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft, fine nib, this is a much gentler tone than you were seeing before. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is giving little bits of shading. Now, the thing about the shading is that's not an incredibly common thing for red inks to do. For one reason or another, they don't tend to shade very often, but with this soft, fine nib, it is shading, and it's doing a pretty decent job at it. Looking at the broad nib, we see it's quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, and it's looking nicer with it. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is still giving little bits of shading. You can see it more from one word to the other, where sometimes a word around it is a bit darker. But take a look at Duke of Brunswick, and right in that title, you see quite a bit of shade variation there. Looking at the music nib, it is much darker than it was with the broad, and it is awesome right here. This is a beautiful red tone. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading. It is solid, very dark, very there, grab your attention, but not hurt your feelings in any way, kind of red on the page. Fantastic. Looking at the back of the page, you see that there's no bleeding and no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib. A Platinum 3776 with a broad nib. A Platinum 3776 with a music nib. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a tone very much like what we had on the Clairfontaine. Really not any change on that. Now, it's not feathering here, it's not spreading, it is giving a little bit of shading that's going on. You can see it in wife, and you can see it in and you can see it in third and it's a sad set of sentences. But here it does look a bit more dramatic with the shading. Looking at the broad nib, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the soft fine. It's not feathering, not spreading. There is still just a little bit of shading going on. You're going to see it in the word salary on the second line, difficulties on the first line. You can see it and with the third line, so it certainly is there. Again, shading is not something for me in red inks that I normally really care for. So here I can't help but not care for it. Looking at the music nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was in the broad, and it is nice. There's no feather, there's no spread, there's no shade. There is only a great, dark, rich tone of red. Really, right there. It's so close to where it could turn that corner and become obnoxious, but it stopped right at bold. Looking at the back of the page, you see that there's no bleeding and no ghosting, no problem writing back here. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a tone just a tad bit lighter than we had with the Clairfontaine. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is still shading fairly well. You see it in make, you see it in more going darker to lighter to darker. You see it in money, where it gets just a little bit lighter right on the O-N-E and dark on the Y again. So it shades. Again, while it's not for me, it's doing it very well. So it's not always about what I like. Looking at the broad nib, quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is shading, but only a little bit. I could deal with none, but I could also deal with how little it is actually shading. It's only minor tone variations from a mid to bit darker tone there, so I could live with it and lie to myself and say that it's not shading. Looking at the music nib, quite a bit darker than it was with the broad. It unfortunately does feather some. You see it in the cross of the T of October. When later in the writing we get down to the fourth and fifth line, you're going to see it on the Y of day, the D of died. There's feathering. There's some minor spread going on. Both of them are minor. Both of them are livable. Best news is with this great dark tone, it is not shading. Looking at the back of the page, you see that it's got no bleed, no ghost, it's got no problem writing back here.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft, fine nib, I get the same tone that was on the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's shading as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. And this paper doesn't normally shade, and yet it does here. So if you want the shading from your red ink and you like these Portage reporter books, win. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. It has no feather, it has no spread, it has very light shading going on, enough that I'm going to call it shading. It's definitely there. You see it in could on the second line, wander in the third line, loneliness, it's definitely there, shading back and forth. The ugliness going on in the M and among, that was me, not the ink or the pen. My bad. Looking at the music nib, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the broad. It is just a little bit lighter than the broad was on the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading. I do wish it was just a little bit darker, but I can't complain about what I'm seeing. I see a beautiful, solid red, cherry red tone. Well named, well made ink. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problems. Awesome.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Ackerman Dutch Masters number 12. Here is Diamine Scarlet. Here is KWZ Raspberry. Here is Robert Oster Royal Red.
The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft, fine nib, we get a tone that's a bit darker than we had with the Clairfontaine. Now, it's not really feathering. I mean, I say not really. There's a couple moments you could be nitpicky, but this paper normally doesn't do well for fountain pens, and this is doing very well. There is the tiniest bit of spread, but again, it's doing very well here, so it's hard to nitpick that. There's even a couple moments of shading, which here are like a warning sign for bleed. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, much darker than we had with it in the Clairfontaine. It's got tiny bits of feathering, tiny bits of spread. Both of them are well manageable if you're prepared for it. Before, I just never written on this paper before with this ink, although I should always be prepared for bad performance from this paper. There is no shading going on, although I do want to point out that there are a couple areas a little bit lighter. Looking at the music nib, we start to see more of the performance we're used to with the paper. This has feathering, tiny feathers all over it. It has some spread, just a little bit, but it is there. It has no shading, so everything that's been happening right here with this one is more how this ink is, or this papers tend to perform with ink. The real question turns to if we're going to have bleeding and destroy pages underneath. To answer that question, none of the ink came through and touched the page underneath. It did an amazing job, despite the fact that you see tons of show through. You can't write on the back of this page, but you can easily use the page underneath. Win.
While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page.
Here's a blue-black ink by Diamine, Eclipse. Here is a gray ink by KWZ, their Gray Lux. Here is a blue ink by Diamine, their 150th anniversary Regency Blue. Here is a black ink by Montblanc, Permanent Black.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than we had with the Clairfontaine, about the same tone that we had with the last paper. It does feather just a little bit. It does spread just a little bit. It does give a little bit of shading, which frequently here means bleeding, but we didn't get any bleed in the last paper, so things become a little more interesting in that case. Looking at the broad nib, we get a darker tone than the soft fine, a little darker than we had with the Clairfontaine, just like it did with the last paper. Now, we do get some feather, we do get some spread, we do not get any shading, nice solid tones all the way through. Honestly, write large, write fast, and this could be the most beautiful correction ink out there on the market. Looking at the music nib, it is much darker than the broad, about the same tone as the last paper, which is okay. It's a little bit lighter, I think, than what we had with the Clairfontaine. Now, it does feather, it does spread. Both of those should be expected. It is not shading. Again, not something we should be expecting with this paper. No surprises here. It all comes down to what happens on the back of the page. Looking at the back of the page, while the ghosting is very strong and you can't write back here, none of it came through and touched the page underneath, making this ink an absolute winner all around.
So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The wetter the pen got, the darker the ink got. And the darker the ink got, the better it looked. So, obviously, I go for any pen, as long as it is really wet to a gusher and that the paper can handle it. But I think what we've seen here is this ink gets handled by inexpensive or non-fountain pen paper pretty well. Means you can do anything as long as you use a gusher and get that beautiful red tone here.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if it leads to you wanting to try this ink, when you purchase it, let the retailer know where you heard about it, whether it's me or any other channel. Thanks for watching.